What if I told you that the man responsible for one of history's darkest chapters built his entire worldview on a twisted interpretation of philosophy, science, and nationalism that he genuinely believed would save humanity? This is the dangerous mind of Adolf Hitler, and understanding these philosophies is crucial to ensuring they never rise again. Born in 1889 in the border town of Braunau am Inn, Austria-Hungary, Adolf Hitler's transformation from failed artist to political extremist unfolded across three distinct and crucial periods that fundamentally shaped his dangerous ideology. Each phase contributed essential elements to what he would later call his Weltanschauung, a complete worldview that would become the philosophical foundation for Nazi Germany's systematic persecution and genocide. The first formative period began when Hitler moved to Vienna in early 1908, following his mother Clara's death. This cosmopolitan capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire presented a stark contrast to his provincial upbringing in Linz. Unlike the overwhelmingly German population of his hometown, Vienna was multi-ethnic, multinational, and multi-religious, containing substantial Jewish and Czech populations that would become targets of his future hatred. Initially, Hitler lived comfortably on his parents' inheritance, pursuing his artistic ambitions without working. However, his dreams of attending the Academy of Fine Arts were crushed when he was rejected twice, first in 1907 and again in 1908 to 1909. By the end of 1909, his inheritance exhausted, Hitler plunged into poverty and was forced to live temporarily in a homeless shelter before moving to a men's hostel. During this desperate period, he began painting watercolor scenes of Vienna, selling them with the help of a business partner to survive. It was during these vulnerable years that Hitler was first systematically exposed to the racist rhetoric that would poison his thinking. The city's political atmosphere was dominated by populist politicians who expertly exploited anti-Semitic sentiment for electoral gain. Most notably, Karl Lueger, co-founder of the Austrian Christian Social Party and Vienna's mayor during Hitler's first 2 years in the city, had built his political career on economic anti-Semitism and innovative political tactics. Lueger was known for his anti-Semitic rhetoric and openly admired Edouard Drumont, founder of France's Anti-Semitic League. He regularly blamed Jews for simply anything and everything, while espousing German nationalist notions for political benefit. Hitler lived in the Mariahilf district, where German nationalist sentiments were particularly widespread. He voraciously consumed local newspapers that promoted prejudice, along with pamphlets related to philosophers and theoreticians such as Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Charles Darwin, Friedrich Nietzsche, Gustav Le Bon, and Arthur Schopenhauer. Significantly, he became strongly influenced by Nordicist philosophers like Georg Lanz von Liebenfels and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who promulgated theories of Aryan Herrenvolk and advocated notions of racial superiority of Nordic peoples. These philosophers claimed that Aryan people faced dangerous threats from those they considered inferior, particularly Jews and Slavs, and advocated for implementing racial purity as necessary for Nordic survival in the modern world. Another crucial influence was the Austrian politician Georg Ritter von Schönauer, a radical pan-Germanic nationalist who campaigned for Austria's incorporation into the German Empire while fervently denouncing Jewish and Slavic minorities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Schönauer's Pan-German Party represented radically nationalist aims that would later echo in Hitler's own political program. However, historical evidence suggests Hitler's anti-Semitic ideology was still developing during this period. Despite later claims that Vienna forged his anti-Semitic worldview, he maintained Jewish acquaintances and business associates, and his efforts to support himself through art sales were made possible primarily by Jewish art dealers. As historians note, Hitler had not yet made anti-Semitism the center of his life during this period, despite his later claims. The Vienna years planted seeds of extremism, but the full flowering of his dangerous ideology would come later. The second formative period encompassed Hitler's World War I experience and Germany's devastating defeat. Hitler served as a messenger in the Bavarian Infantry Regiment, participating in major battles including the First Battle of Ypres. The war provided him with a sense of purpose and belonging he had never experienced, making Germany's eventual defeat all the more psychologically shattering. When Germany surrendered in November 1918, Hitler, like many Germans, found it difficult to accept that their military had been genuinely defeated on the battlefield. The German population had been kept largely uninformed about the military's collapsing situation, making the sudden armistice seem inexplicable. Into this psychological void emerged the stab-in-the-back myth, Dolchstoßlegende, an anti-Semitic and anti-communist conspiracy theory that would become central to Hitler's worldview. This myth maintained that the Imperial German Army had not lost World War I on the battlefield but was instead betrayed by certain citizens on the home front. especially Jews, revolutionary socialists who fomented strikes and labor unrest, and Republican politicians who had overthrown the monarchy in the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. German military leaders, including Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, actively promoted this false narrative. On November 18, 1919, Hindenburg testified before a parliamentary committee investigating Germany's defeat, claiming that revolutionary forces had sabotaged the German military and caused its collapse. The stab-in-the-back myth had devastating psychological and political consequences. Many Germans accepted the idea that this alleged betrayal made both the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles illegitimate. The myth provided simple explanations for complex military and economic realities, offering scapegoats rather than requiring Germans to confront the reality of their nation's defeat. Veterans made up almost a fifth of Germany's post-war population. Approximately 13 million Germans had served in World War I, with 2 million killed but the rest returning home. This meant the stab-in-the-back myth resonated personally with a huge audience that didn't want to believe they had genuinely lost the war. For Hitler, this conspiracy theory became a cornerstone of his emerging worldview. It explained Germany's defeat not through military failure but through internal betrayal, particularly by Jews whom he increasingly saw as the orchestrators of Germany's downfall. The myth provided a narrative framework that connected his growing anti-Semitism with his extreme nationalism, creating what he saw as a mission to save Germany from both external enemies and internal traitors. The third and most crucial period began with Hitler's entry into politics in Munich during the early 1920s. By 1923, his political radicalism had developed to the point where he attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch or Munich Putsch. On November 8 to 9, 1923, Hitler led approximately 600 Sturmabteilung SA members in a failed coup attempt. The putsch began when Hitler and his followers marched on the Bergerbraukeler Beer Hall, where Bavarian Minister-President Gustav Ritter von Kahr was speaking. Hitler fired a shot into the ceiling and declared that the Bavarian government had been overthrown and the national revolution had begun. The following day, approximately 2,000 Nazis marched toward the city center but were confronted by police, resulting in the deaths of 15 Nazis, 4 police officers, and 1 bystander. Hitler escaped immediate arrest but was captured 2 days later and charged with treason. Paradoxically, this failure became a propaganda victory. The putsch brought Hitler national attention for the first time, generating front-page headlines worldwide. His subsequent 24-day trial gave him a platform to express his nationalist sentiments and further develop his public persona. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, where he would serve only 9 months due to early release on December 20, 1924. However, this imprisonment period proved intellectually transformative. It was during his comfortable confinement at Landsberg that Hitler began systematically developing his comprehensive worldview into written form. Initially receiving many visitors, Hitler soon devoted himself entirely to writing what would become Mein Kampf. He dictated the work to fellow prisoners, first Emil Maurice and then Rudolf Hess, who had fled to Austria after the putsch, returned, been arrested, and sent to the same prison. The process was collaborative. The book was edited by Emil Maurice, Rudolf Hess, and later by publisher Max Amann. Originally planned as a multi-volume work, the first volume was completed in prison and published in 1925, with a second volume following in 1926. The title Mein Kampf, My Struggle, reportedly came from Max Amann's suggestion, though the first volume retained the subtitle Eine Berechnung, Settling Accounts, reflecting Hitler's desire to settle scores with his perceived enemies. The prison governor noted that Hitler hopes the book will run into many editions, thus enabling him to fulfill his financial obligations and to defray the expenses incurred at the time of his trial. What emerged from these 3 formative periods was not mere political opportunism but what Hitler explicitly called his Weltanschauung, a complete worldview that would serve as the ideological framework for Nazi Germany. Hitler's use of this term was distinctive and dangerous. Unlike traditional philosophical worldviews rooted in religious revelation or scientific observation, Hitler's Weltanschauung was purely pragmatic and racial. For Hitler, worldview did not need to provide accurate understanding of natural laws, but merely had to help individuals and races succeed in what he saw as a Darwinian struggle for existence. Its suitability was determined by outcome, whether it enabled a race to fulfill what he called its Mission Sendung in history. This marked a significant departure from conventional epistemological foundations. Crucially, Hitler's worldview spoke not to the values or culture of a people, but to what he claimed was their common biological disposition, Veranlagung. This racial disposition, he asserted, originated in divine providence, and worldview enabled a race to reach toward fulfilling its historical purpose. The purpose of worldview was not to help individuals achieve objective self-consciousness, but to unify a collective and give it the ability to act. Hitler applied what he called an aesthetic test to his own ideology. Like a work of art, worldview had to resonate with its racially homogeneous audience. Where worldview failed to mobilize the masses, it had to be modified. This pragmatic approach led him to sideline folkish cultural elements when they threatened party growth, making contemptuous remarks about Wotan worshippers, and removing zealous ideologues like Artur Dinter when they proved counterproductive. As Hitler wrote, everything is to be measured and used or discarded according to its utility. At its core, he claimed for his faith only one doctrine: People, Volk, and Fatherland, Vaterland. This statement revealed both the racial theory cornerstone of his worldview and the primacy he placed on the audience that worldview was meant to unite. Historian James Joll's assessment proved prophetic. Mein Kampf contained all of Hitler's beliefs, most of his program, and much of his character. The work that emerged from Landsberg prison was not simply a political manifesto but the systematic codification of a dangerous worldview forged through personal failure, national defeat, conspiracy theories, and extremist influences. This Weltanschauung provided the ideological foundation that would later justify genocide, aggressive war, and the systematic destruction of human rights across Europe. The transformation was complete. The failed artist and homeless vagrant of Vienna had become the systematic ideologist whose worldview would plunge the world into its darkest chapter. Principle 1. The basic principle of the blood racial hierarchy. Hitler's entire philosophical framework rested on what he explicitly termed the basic principle of the blood, a mystical and pseudo-scientific concept that became the cornerstone of Nazi ideology. This principle represented far more than simple racial prejudice. It constituted a complete metaphysical system that Hitler believed explained all of human history, culture, and destiny. According to this twisted worldview, blood was not merely a biological fluid but the very vessel of the soul, containing what he called the spiritual energies and cultural energies that determined both individual character and racial capability. In Hitler's ideological construct, the blood of every person contained not only their individual soul but also the collective soul of their race, their Volk. This was not metaphorical language but what he presented as literal truth, that blood physically carried spiritual essence and determined intellectual, creative, and moral capacity. He declared that the racial question gives the key not only to world history, but to all human culture, establishing race as what he called the granite foundation of his entire ideology. This concept drew heavily from folkish mysticism and distorted interpretations of romantic nationalism, combining pseudo-scientific racial theories with quasi-religious spiritual claims. Hitler's formulation went beyond traditional racism by asserting that racial characteristics were divinely ordained and that blood purity was essential for maintaining the spiritual essence of a people. The blood principle thus served as both biological determinism and spiritual doctrine, claiming that racial mixing would contaminate not just physical characteristics but the very soul of a race. Central to Hitler's racial hierarchy was his claim that God himself had created Aryans as the most perfect men, both physically and spiritually. This assertion elevated racial theory to the level of divine mandate, suggesting that Aryan superiority was not merely evolutionary but represented God's intentional design for humanity. In this theology of race, Aryans were positioned as the pinnacle of divine creation, blessed with unique spiritual energies that made them the natural rulers of the earth. Hitler frequently employed grandiose religious language to describe Aryan capabilities and destiny. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that the Aryan is the Prometheus of mankind from whose shining brow the divine spark of genius has sprung at all times, forever kindling anew that fire of knowledge which illumined the night of silent mysteries and thus caused man to climb the path to mastery over the other beings of this earth. This Promethean imagery cast Aryans as the bringers of fire, civilization itself, to humanity, suggesting they alone possess the divine spark necessary for cultural creation. The implications of this divine origin theory were profound and deadly. If Aryans were God's chosen race, then their dominance was not just natural but morally imperative. Hitler declared his intention to establish a 1,000-year Reich, describing his supporters as fellow fighters for a unique spiritual, I would almost say divine creation. This language transformed political movement into religious crusade, making Nazi ideology appear as the fulfillment of divine will rather than human prejudice. Hitler's blood principle established a strict hierarchical ordering of human races, with Aryans, particularly Nordic Germanic peoples, positioned as the master race or Herrenvolk at the apex. This hierarchy was not merely about cultural differences, but claimed to represent objective differences in human worth and capability. The Nazi racial classification system placed Germanic peoples, especially those exhibiting Nordic characteristics such as tall stature, light skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair, as the purest representatives of Aryan blood. Below the master race, Hitler's system included various gradations of worthiness. Other Northern and Western European peoples, Dutch, Scandinavians, English, were considered Aryan but of somewhat lesser purity. Southern Europeans, particularly Italians and some Greeks, were deemed to have sufficient Germanic admixture to be tolerable, while the French were thought to possess adequate Germanic blood despite some racial mixing. Eastern Europeans, particularly Slavs, were classified as work-tier work animals, useful only as laborers for their Aryan superiors. At the bottom of this fabricated hierarchy were Jews, whom Hitler designated as the most inferior race and the greatest threat to Aryan purity. Unlike other groups classified as inferior, Jews were characterized not merely as racially subordinate but as actively malevolent, a parasitic race that threatened to destroy Aryan civilization through racial mixing and cultural corruption. This positioning justified not just discrimination but extermination, as Jews were presented as an existential threat to the divinely ordained Aryan mission. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Hitler's blood principle was his claim that different races possessed fundamentally different spiritual energies, or cultural energies. According to this theory, the blood of Aryans contained specific spiritual essences that enabled them to create what he called higher culture, art, science, philosophy, and all the achievements that distinguished civilization from barbarism. He asserted that all that man calls higher culture was ultimately the product of the spiritual and creative energies that exist in the blood of the Aryans. This spiritual racism went beyond claims about intelligence or physical capability to assert that different races possessed different souls. Hitler claimed that Aryans were superior not just intellectually but spiritually, being most capable of sacrifice, and possessing the deepest cultural sensibilities. Remove Aryans from the world, he argued, and all that remains is ape dances. Civilization itself would collapse without their unique spiritual contribution. The concept of spiritual energy also explained, in Hitler's twisted logic, why racial mixing was so dangerous. When Aryans intermarried with inferior races, they didn't just dilute their physical characteristics but contaminated their spiritual essence. The resulting mixed-race offspring would lack the cultural creativity and spiritual depth necessary to maintain civilization. Hitler wrote extensively about historical examples where he claimed Aryan conquerors had initially created great civilizations but then transgressed against the principle of blood purity through intermarriage, leading to cultural decline and eventual collapse. Hitler's racial theory positioned Aryans not just as superior beings but as bearers of a divine cultural mission. Since only Aryan blood contained the spiritual energies necessary for creating higher culture, they alone were responsible for all human advancement. He claimed that virtually every manifestation of human civilization, art, science, technology, philosophy, was almost exclusively Aryan-produced. This gave Aryans both the right and the obligation to dominate other races, since their cultural contributions justified their supremacy. The Japanese presented a particular challenge to this theory, as their technological and cultural achievements were difficult to dismiss. Hitler resolved this contradiction by claiming that Japanese culture was actually European and American, that is, Aryan. Without continued Aryan influence, he argued, Japan's scientific and technological progress would within a few years begin to die away. This demonstrated the totalizing nature of his racial worldview. Any achievement by non-Aryans had to be explained as derivative from Aryan influence. The blood principle extended beyond cultural capability to encompass all aspects of human character and moral capacity. Hitler claimed that a person's ability, aptitude, attitude, and character was determined by race, making individual differences subordinate to racial categories. This biological determinism eliminated the possibility of individual merit transcending racial classification. A person's worth was fixed by their blood composition from birth. This deterministic view had profound implications for Nazi policy and practice. If character and capability were biologically determined by race, then social problems could be solved through racial engineering rather than education, economic reform, or individual development. Crime, poverty, mental illness, and moral failings were all attributed to racial defects that could only be addressed through selective breeding and racial purification. Hitler's blood principle functioned as a form of racial religion, complete with creation myths, divine mandates, and apocalyptic prophecies. The Aryan race became a sacred entity whose preservation was humanity's highest moral imperative. Racial purity took on the character of religious duty, while racial mixing became a form of sin against divine order. This religious dimension helped explain the fanatical devotion of Nazi followers and the quasi-mystical language surrounding racial ideology. The ultimate goal of this racial religion was the establishment of what Hitler called a racially pure state that would become Lord of the Earth. This millennial vision combined racial supremacy with territorial expansion and global domination, presenting Nazi conquest as the fulfillment of divine plan rather than human ambition. The Thousand-Year Reich was not merely a political goal but the realization of racial destiny, when Aryans would finally achieve their God-given role as masters of the world. The basic principle of the blood thus represented far more than racial prejudice. It constituted a complete theological and philosophical system that justified genocide, aggressive war, and the systematic dehumanization of entire populations. By clothing racial hatred in the language of divine mandate and scientific law, Hitler created an ideology that convinced millions that their most brutal impulses were actually moral imperatives. Understanding this principle is crucial for recognizing how dangerous ideologies can transform prejudice into systematic atrocity through the manipulation of spiritual and scientific authority. Principle 2. Lebensraum, the drive for living space. Central to Hitler's philosophical and strategic worldview was the concept of Lebensraum, literally translated as living space, which represented far more than a simple territorial ambition. This principle formed the ideological cornerstone for Nazi Germany's systematic expansion eastward and provided the pseudo-scientific justification for genocidal policies across Eastern Europe. Hitler's conception of Lebensraum was not merely about acquiring more land, but about fulfilling what he presented as Germany's divine destiny and ensuring the survival of the German race in what he characterized as an eternal struggle for existence. Hitler's articulation of Lebensraum theory drew heavily from the geopolitical writings of Friedrich Ratzel, whose concept of living space was originally developed as an academic theory about the geographical requirements for national survival. However, Hitler transformed Ratzel's relatively neutral geographic concept into a racialized and militarized ideology that justified aggressive expansion and ethnic cleansing. During his imprisonment in Landsberg following the failed beer hall putsch, Hitler was influenced by political geographer Karl Haushofer, who introduced him to Ratzel's theories and helped him develop a more sophisticated understanding of geopolitics. In Mein Kampf, Hitler dedicated an entire chapter titled Eastern Orientation or Eastern Policy to outlining Germany's need for new living space. He argued that the expanding German population required not just more territory, but specifically agricultural land that could support what he claimed was Germany's growing demographic needs. This was not merely about population pressure, but about creating what he called a racially pure state that could become Lord of the Earth. Hitler declared that Germany's survival depended on this expansion, writing that the nation needed to become a world power or it will not continue to exist at all. Hitler explicitly connected his Lebensraum policy to medieval German expansion eastward, invoking what historians call the Drang nach Osten, drive to the east. In Mein Kampf, he wrote, "We take up where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west, and turn our gaze toward the land in the east." This reference pointed to the medieval German colonization of Slavic territories that occurred primarily between the 11th and 15th centuries. The medieval Drang nach Osten had involved German nobles, merchants, farmers, and monks moving beyond the Elbe River to colonize territories inhabited by Slavic peoples. Hitler romanticized this historical expansion as evidence of Germany's natural destiny to dominate Eastern Europe. He presented his contemporary expansion plans not as aggressive imperialism but as the resumption of Germany's historical mission, claiming that Germans were simply reclaiming territories that were rightfully theirs. This historical framing served crucial ideological purposes. By connecting Nazi expansion to medieval precedent, Hitler made territorial conquest appear as the restoration of natural order rather than unprovoked aggression. The medieval German expansion had been conducted under religious auspices, converting pagan Slavs to Christianity, while Hitler's version substituted racial ideology for religious mission. Both campaigns, however, involved the systematic displacement and subjugation of Slavic populations. Hitler's Lebensraum theory rested on claims about German overpopulation that he presented as scientific fact but which were largely fabricated. He declared, "We are overpopulated and cannot feed ourselves from our own resources." According to his analysis, Germany's limited territory constrained population growth, leading to what he characterized as dangerously low birth rates among Germans. He argued that without territorial expansion, the German race would face demographic decline and eventual extinction. However, Hitler's demographic claims were contradicted by contemporary evidence. Germany in the 1920s and 1930s was not experiencing population pressure that required territorial expansion for survival. Instead, Hitler was using population arguments to justify territorial ambitions that were primarily motivated by his racial ideology and imperial aspirations. He envisioned creating what he called a greater economic area that would be self-sufficient and capable of supporting a vastly expanded German population. The economic dimension of Lebensraum focused particularly on agricultural resources and raw materials. Hitler coveted the agricultural richness of Ukraine, which he called the granary of Europe, as well as the industrial resources of the Urals and Siberia. He believed that controlling these territories would make Germany blockade-proof and economically independent, eliminating the vulnerability that had contributed to Germany's defeat in World War I. His vision included Ukraine providing grain, vegetable oil, and iron ore, Crimea supplying natural rubber and cotton, and the Caucasus delivering crude oil. What distinguished Hitler's Lebensraum from traditional territorial expansion was its explicitly racial character. The living space was not intended for all Germans, but specifically for what he considered racially pure Aryans who would serve as colonial masters over enslaved Slavic populations. Hitler envisioned the creation of a racial empire where Germanic settlers would function as a ruling class, supported by Slavic labor forces reduced to serfdom. The implementation of this racial colonization was detailed in General Plan Ost, the Nazi blueprint for Eastern Europe developed between 1939 and 1942. This plan called for the systematic extermination, deportation, or enslavement of 31 million Slavs to make room for German settlers. The remaining Slavic population would be reduced to illiterate laborers serving German masters, with their cultural identity systematically destroyed. An estimated 10 million Germans and ethnic Germans were to be resettled in the cleared territories. Hitler explicitly compared his colonization plans to the American conquest of the West, viewing the destruction of Native American peoples as a successful template for German expansion. During his famous table talks, he declared that Germany should Germanize this country Russia by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins. This comparison was not casual. Nazi planners studied American frontier policies and adapted them for Eastern European conquest. Hitler's Lebensraum principle was not merely theoretical, but became the driving force behind Nazi Germany's military strategy and territorial expansion. The annexation of Austria in 1938, the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, the invasion of Poland in 1939, and ultimately the massive assault on the Soviet Union in 1941 were all direct implementations of Lebensraum ideology. Each conquest was justified as necessary for German survival and racial destiny. The invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, represented the culmination of Hitler's Lebensraum ambitions. This was explicitly conceived not as a conventional military campaign, but as a war of racial extermination and colonial conquest. German military directives specified that the war against the Soviet Union was to be conducted with unprecedented brutality, as it was viewed as a struggle between racial worldviews rather than nation-states. The territories conquered in Eastern Europe were organized into colonial administrations designed to extract maximum resources while preparing for Germanic settlement. The general government in Poland, Reichskommissariat Ostland in the Baltic states, and Reichskommissariat Ukraine were established as transitional administrations pending full Germanization. Additional administrative divisions were planned for European Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, indicating the scope of Hitler's imperial vision. Hitler's Lebensraum concept was not limited to Eastern Europe, but formed part of a broader vision of global German hegemony. He believed that control of the Eurasian landmass would provide Germany with the resources and strategic position necessary to challenge the other world powers, particularly the United States and the British Empire. The living space in the East was conceived as the foundation for eventual world domination. This global ambition was evident in Hitler's alliance strategies and long-term planning. He supported Italian expansion in the Mediterranean, Spazio Vitale, and Japanese expansion in Asia, Hakoikyu, as complementary imperial projects that would establish Axis control over the world's major regions. The ultimate goal was a world order dominated by racially superior peoples, with Germans serving as the master race of the Eurasian heartland. Perhaps most significantly, Hitler presented Lebensraum not as an option but as an existential necessity for the German people. He argued that nations, like biological organisms, must either expand or face extinction in the struggle for existence. This social Darwinist framework made territorial conquest appear as natural law rather than political choice. Germany could either seize its living space through force or face demographic and cultural death. This apocalyptic framing served to justify the unlimited brutality of Nazi expansion. Since the survival of the German race was allegedly at stake, any means were permissible to secure the necessary territory. The extermination of millions of Slavs and Jews was presented not as genocide but as biological necessity, clearing inferior populations to make room for superior ones. The Lebensraum principle thus transformed aggressive war and mass murder into what Hitler claimed were acts of racial self-defense. The concept of Lebensraum represented the systematic transformation of territorial ambition into racial ideology, providing the philosophical framework that made the Holocaust and World War II's unprecedented destruction appear rational to Nazi leaders and their followers. It demonstrated how pseudo-scientific theories could be weaponized to justify crimes against humanity on an industrial scale. Principle 3. Folkish nationalism, the mythical German folk. Hitler's embrace of folkish ideology represented one of the most dangerous and seductive aspects of Nazi philosophy, transforming crude political opportunism into what appeared to be a profound spiritual and cultural movement. The folkish concept, derived from the German word Volk meaning people or folk, was not simply another form of nationalism, but rather a romanticized mystical belief system that idealized an imaginary German past while rejecting the complexities of modern civilization. This principle became the emotional and spiritual core of Nazi ideology, providing Hitler with a quasi-religious authority that elevated him from mere politician to what his followers perceived as a divinely appointed leader of the German race. The folkish movement emerged in the late 19th century as a response to the rapid industrialization, urbanization, and modernization that was transforming German society. Unlike rational political ideologies based on economic theories or institutional frameworks, folkish nationalism was fundamentally emotional and mystical, rooted in a romanticized vision of pre-industrial German peasant life. The movement's adherents believed that the essence of German character, indeed, the German soul itself, was best preserved among farmers and peasants who had remained uncorrupted by modern influences. Hitler explicitly articulated this vision in Mein Kampf and his political speeches, declaring that the German Volk were epitomized by German farmers and peasants, people who remained uncorrupted by modern ideals and whose greatest attribute was their cheerful subservience and their capacity to respond to their monarchical calling. This phrase, cheerful subservience, revealed the authoritarian core of folkish ideology. It celebrated not German independence or democratic participation, but rather the willingness of the folk to submit joyfully to hierarchical leadership. The romantic idealization of peasant life was not merely nostalgic, but served specific political purposes. By presenting rural Germans as the embodiment of racial purity and cultural authenticity, folkish ideology created a hierarchy that positioned urban, educated, cosmopolitan Germans as somehow less authentically German. This division would prove crucial in Nazi efforts to mobilize rural support while undermining liberal democratic institutions associated with urban centers. Central to Hitler's folkish philosophy was the concept of Blut und Boden, blood and soil, developed and systematized by Nazi agricultural minister Richard Walther Dahr. This doctrine held that German blood was mystically connected to German soil, creating an organic unity between race and territory that transcended mere political boundaries. According to this ideology, German land was bound, perhaps mystically, to German blood, making the relationship between people and territory a sacred rather than merely practical consideration. Dahr's formulation presented peasants as the Nazi cultural heroes, who held charge of German racial stock and German history. In folkish thinking, farmers were not simply agricultural workers but the guardians of racial purity and cultural continuity. Their connection to the soil allegedly preserved both their racial characteristics and their spiritual essence, making them the foundation upon which a racially pure German state could be built. This mystical connection between blood and soil was presented as scientific fact rather than romantic fantasy. Dahr argued that Germans belonged to a settled race whose culture had been developed through generations of peasant connection to specific territories. In contrast, he classified Jews as members of a nomadic race whose parasitic nature prevented them from developing authentic cultural connections to any land. This pseudo-scientific framework transformed agricultural policy into racial ideology and made farming appear as a form of racial duty. Folkish ideology was fundamentally anti-modern, viewing industrialization, urbanization, and cultural cosmopolitanism as threats to German racial integrity. Hitler and Nazi propagandists consistently portrayed urban culture as asphalt culture, a derogatory term suggesting artificiality and disconnection from natural German roots. Cities were characterized as breeding grounds for racial mixing, cultural degeneracy, and what Nazis coded as Jewish influence on German society. This rejection of modernity was not simply cultural preference, but represented a comprehensive worldview that saw technological and social progress as inherently destructive to racial purity. Nazi propaganda depicted the flight of people from countryside to city as a form of racial suicide, showing how industrial society allegedly corrupted authentic German character. Educational materials distributed in schools portrayed urban migration as leading to all its demoralizing effects, while rural life was presented as the source of racial and moral health. The folkish movement's anti-modernism extended to democracy itself, which was viewed as a foreign imposition that weakened the natural hierarchy supposedly inherent in German folk society. Democratic processes were characterized as divisive and corrupting, preventing the German people from expressing their authentic collective will through traditional leaders. This critique provided ideological justification for Nazi authoritarianism, presenting dictatorship as a return to authentic German political traditions rather than as modern totalitarianism. Perhaps the most politically significant aspect of folkish ideology was its transformation of political leadership into quasi-religious authority. The movement's emphasis on monarchical calling provided Hitler with a framework for presenting himself not as an ordinary politician seeking power, but as a leader called by destiny to restore German greatness. This monarchical principle drew on romantic notions of medieval German kingship while adapting them to modern conditions. Hitler skillfully positioned himself as the embodiment of folkish aspirations, presenting his leadership as the natural expression of German folk wisdom rather than personal ambition. Nazi propaganda consistently emphasized Hitler's connection to authentic German traditions while portraying his opponents as representatives of foreign ideologies, liberalism, socialism, cosmopolitanism, that threatened the folkish community. This framework transformed political opposition into cultural betrayal and made support for Hitler appear as an expression of German identity itself. The folkish concept of leadership differed fundamentally from both democratic and traditional monarchical models. Unlike elected leaders who derived authority from popular consent, or hereditary monarchs who claimed legitimacy through bloodline succession, Hitler's authority was presented as emerging directly from his embodiment of German folk characteristics. He was portrayed as the Führer who uniquely understood and could express the deepest aspirations of the German Volk, making his personal will identical with the collective will of the people. Folkish ideology functioned as a form of political religion, complete with sacred narratives, ritual practices, and transcendent goals. The concept of Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, promised to overcome the alienation and fragmentation of modern society by restoring an organic unity based on racial and cultural bonds. This community was presented not as a political arrangement but as the restoration of natural order, making participation appear as both privilege and duty. Nazi cultural policy systematically promoted folkish values through art, literature, music, and public festivals that celebrated idealized peasant life. These cultural productions were not mere entertainment but served as vehicles for transmitting folkish ideology and creating emotional bonds between individuals and the Nazi movement. The elevation of folk culture over high culture democratized Nazi ideology while making it appear authentically German rather than imposed by political elites. The religious dimension of folkish ideology was particularly evident in its treatment of German history and destiny. Nazi propagandists reinterpreted German cultural figures, from Luther to Goethe to Wagner, as early expressions of folkish consciousness, creating a narrative of continuous German spiritual development culminating in the Third Reich. This historical mythology provided Nazi ideology with apparent intellectual depth while justifying contemporary policies as the fulfillment of German destiny. While folkish ideology emphasized inclusion and community for those deemed authentically German, it was fundamentally exclusionary in its definition of who belonged to the Volk. The movement's racial criteria meant that German citizenship, cultural participation, or even patriotic commitment were insufficient for membership in the folkish community. Only those meeting racial standards, primarily defined in opposition to Jewish identity, could claim authentic German status. This exclusionary logic transformed folkish nationalism from inclusive patriotism into racial ideology. The emphasis on blood and soil made German identity appear as natural fact rather than cultural choice, eliminating the possibility that non-Germans could assimilate into German society. Jews, Roma, and other minorities were classified not as German citizens with different backgrounds, but as foreign elements whose presence threatened the integrity of the folkish community. The folkish ideal of organic community had totalitarian implications that became evident once Nazis gained power. The concept of Volksgemeinschaft demanded not merely political loyalty but complete integration of individual identity with collective identity. Personal interests, independent thinking, and private loyalties that conflicted with folkish solidarity were characterized as selfish individualism that weakened the folk community. Nazi implementation of folkish ideology involved systematic efforts to reshape German society according to blood and soil principles. Agricultural policies promoted rural settlement and discouraged urban migration, while cultural policies eliminated artistic expressions deemed incompatible with folkish values. Educational reforms emphasized folk traditions over academic subjects, and youth organizations indoctrinated children in folkish ideology from an early age. The ultimate goal of folkish transformation was the creation of what Nazis called a new nobility of blood and soil, a racial elite that would guide German destiny for generations. This nobility would be based not on inherited titles or wealth, but on racial purity and connection to German soil. The peasantry would serve as both the foundation and the model for this new aristocracy, demonstrating how folkish ideology elevated rural Germans while simultaneously constraining them within rigid hierarchical structures. Hitler's embrace of folkish ideology thus represented more than political strategy. It was the systematic transformation of romantic nationalism into totalitarian religion, providing emotional and spiritual justification for policies that would ultimately lead to genocide and world war. By presenting himself as the authentic expression of German folk wisdom, Hitler made opposition to his regime appear as betrayal of German identity itself, demonstrating how cultural manipulation could serve the most destructive political ends. Principle 4. Social Darwinism, survival of the fittest as divine law. Hitler's distortion of Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory into a brutal social philosophy represented one of the most dangerous pseudo-scientific foundations of Nazi ideology. By transforming biological concepts of natural selection into moral imperatives for human society, Hitler created a framework that not only justified discrimination but made extermination appear as natural law and divine commandment. This perversion of scientific theory became the ideological cornerstone that enabled systematic genocide, presenting mass murder as biological necessity rather than human choice. In Hitler's twisted worldview, natural selection was not merely a biological process but represented the most divine laws governing all existence. He explicitly declared that struggle is a means to improve the health and stamina of the species, and thus a cause of its evolution. This elevation of evolutionary struggle to sacred status transformed what Darwin had described as a natural phenomenon into a moral imperative that humans were obligated to follow. Hitler argued that by any other process all development and evolution would cease, and the very reverse would take place. This religious interpretation of evolution made Hitler's racial policies appear not as political choices, but as compliance with divine will. He frequently equated natural law with survival of the fittest, and identified God with the unknown or nature, or whatever name one chooses. By presenting his genocidal agenda as obedience to natural law, Hitler transformed murder into what appeared to be scientific necessity and religious duty. The struggle for existence became, in Nazi ideology, humanity's sacred obligation to assist nature in its work of racial improvement. Hitler's formulation of social Darwinism was most systematically outlined in his second book, which opened with a chapter titled The Struggle for Life, using Darwin's own terminology. In this work, Hitler explained that organisms, including humans, reproduce faster than available resources and living space, making the struggle for existence inevitable. He declared, "In the limitation of this living space lies the compulsion for the struggle for survival, and the struggle for survival, in turn, contains the precondition for evolution." This biological determinism extended beyond individual competition to encompass entire races and nations. Hitler believed that all racial groups shared the same drive for collective survival, competing against one another for finite resources and space in which to grow. The stakes of this racial survival of the fittest mentality were particularly high because Hitler claimed that superior races were constantly threatened with infiltration and corruption by inferior peoples. Victory in this struggle was not optional but represented the fundamental requirement for racial survival. The universality of struggle meant that no neutral position was possible in Hitler's worldview. He famously declared, "He who would live must fight. He who doesn't wish to fight in this world, where permanent struggle is the law of life, has not the right to exist." This formulation eliminated any possibility of peaceful coexistence between races or nations, making conflict appear as the natural state of human existence. Politics became, in Nazi ideology, merely the straightforward application of the laws of biology. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of Hitler's social Darwinism was his argument that protecting those he deemed inferior constituted interference with natural law. In the first edition of Mein Kampf, Hitler explicitly stated that the destruction of the weak and sick is far more humane than their protection. He claimed that those incapable of asserting themselves were viewed as doomed to annihilation, with the right to life being granted only to those who could survive on their own. This philosophy provided the ideological foundation for the Nazi euthanasia program, codenamed Action T4, which systematically murdered an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 disabled individuals between 1939 and 1945. Hitler had spelled out the Nazi concept of racial hygiene in Mein Kampf, writing that Germany must see to it that only the healthy beget children using modern medical means. The program was designed to eliminate what eugenicists callously termed life unworthy of life. The T4 program revealed the practical implementation of Hitler's social Darwinist ideology. Nazi leaders established panels of medical experts whose role was to approve the so-called euthanasia of children and adults as mercy killings. Families would receive official letters demanding that their disabled relatives be sent to institutions, where they would be murdered. Parents later received deceitful letters stating that their children had died of illness, along with false death certificates and ashes from common crematorium piles. Hitler's social Darwinism established a rigid hierarchy of human races based on alleged evolutionary advancement. He claimed that Germans were members of a superior group he called Aryan, whose biological superiority destined them to rule a vast empire across Eastern Europe. This racial hierarchy was presented not as cultural preference, but as scientific fact derived from evolutionary theory. The typical Aryan in Nazi ideology was blonde, blue-eyed, and tall, representing the highest stage of human evolutionary development. Below the master race, Hitler's system included various gradations of human worth. Other racial groups were classified as inferior races, whose genetic makeup allegedly prevented them from achieving Aryan levels of cultural and intellectual development. Jews occupied a special position in this hierarchy as what Hitler characterized as a parasitic race that threatened Aryan survival through racial mixing and cultural corruption. Slavs were classified as subhuman peoples whose primary value lay in their potential as slave labor for their Aryan masters. This racial classification system had deadly practical consequences. Hitler argued that maintaining race purity was essential because mixing with other races would over time lead to bastardization and degeneration of a race to the point where it lost its distinguishing characteristics and, in effect, lost the capacity to effectively defend itself, thus becoming doomed to extinction. The preservation of racial hierarchy thus became a matter of biological survival rather than social preference. Hitler's social Darwinism provided what appeared to be scientific justification for genocide by presenting mass murder as evolutionary necessity. He argued that if Germany did not act decisively against the Jews both at home and abroad, hordes of subhuman, uncivilized Slavs and Asiatics that the Jews could mobilize would sweep away the Aryan German race. This apocalyptic framing made extermination appear as racial self-defense rather than aggressive violence. The Nazi implementation of social Darwinist ideology culminated in what they called the final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jewry. Hitler believed that once inferior races were exterminated, the Aryan race would be free to achieve its evolutionary destiny. The Holocaust was thus presented not as genocide, but as the completion of natural selection, with humans merely assisting nature in its work of racial improvement. Several passages in Mein Kampf explicitly articulated this genocidal logic. Hitler wrote that the nationalization of our masses will succeed only when, aside from all the positive struggle for the soul of our people, their international poisoners are exterminated. He suggested that if at the beginning of the war and during the war 12 or 15,000 of these Hebrew corruptors of the nation had been subjected to poison gas, such as had to be endured in the field by hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers of all classes and professions, then the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain. Hitler's social Darwinism gained credibility by appropriating the authority of legitimate science while fundamentally distorting its conclusions. Leading Nazi biologists and physicians actively promoted these distorted interpretations, claiming that Darwin's theory supported racial hierarchy and justified genocide. The philosophy that humans can control and even use Darwinism to produce a higher level of human was repeatedly mentioned in Nazi writings and speeches. However, Hitler's interpretation represented a fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary theory. Darwin's actual work emphasized the diversity and interconnectedness of species, not hierarchical rankings of superior and inferior organisms. The concept of survival of the fittest referred to reproductive success in specific environments, not moral or cultural superiority. Darwin himself never suggested that evolutionary principles should guide human social organization or justify the elimination of supposedly inferior groups. The Nazi appropriation of evolutionary language served to legitimize policies that contradicted genuine scientific understanding. As one scholar noted, the basic outline of German social Darwinism was that man was merely a part of nature with no special transcendent qualities or special humanness. On the other hand, the Germans were members of a biologically superior community. This contradiction, denying human transcendence while claiming German superiority, revealed the incoherent nature of Nazi pseudoscience. Hitler's social Darwinism was not merely theoretical but became the driving force behind Nazi policies of unprecedented brutality. He once declared that we Nazis are barbarians. We want to be barbarians. It is an honorable title for, by it, we shall rejuvenate the world. This embrace of barbarism was presented as evolutionary advancement rather than moral regression. Hitler, as an evolutionist, consciously sought to make the practice of Germany conform to the theory of evolution. The practical implementation of social Darwinist ideology extended far beyond individual violence to encompass systematic campaigns of racial extermination. The general plan Ost called for the elimination of 31 million Slavs to make room for German settlers. The Holocaust targeted 6 million Jews for complete extermination. The T4 euthanasia program murdered hundreds of thousands of disabled individuals. Each of these genocidal programs was justified through appeals to evolutionary necessity and natural law. The machinery developed for the T4 program served as what historians call a rehearsal for the final solution. The methods of deception, transportation, killing, and body disposal perfected in the murder of disabled individuals were later applied on a massive scale during the Holocaust. This progression demonstrated how Hitler's social Darwinist ideology created an inexorable logic of elimination that ultimately consumed millions of innocent lives. Hitler's transformation of evolutionary theory into a mandate for genocide represents one of history's most dangerous examples of pseudoscientific manipulation. By clothing racial hatred in the language of biological necessity and divine law, Nazi ideology made mass murder appear not only acceptable but morally imperative. The principle of social Darwinism thus became the philosophical foundation for crimes against humanity on an unprecedented scale, demonstrating how scientific authority can be weaponized to justify the unjustifiable. Principle 5. The Führerprinzip, absolute leadership. Hitler's establishment of the Führerprinzip leader principle represented far more than conventional authoritarianism. It constituted a comprehensive philosophical rejection of democratic governance, individual rights, and the rule of law. This principle became the fundamental organizing structure of Nazi ideology and practice, creating a hierarchical system that placed Hitler at the apex as the infallible embodiment of German destiny while demanding absolute obedience from all subordinates. Unlike traditional monarchies or military dictatorships, the Führerprinzip transformed political authority into quasi-religious devotion, making Hitler not merely a ruler but a mystical figure whose will superseded all written law and constitutional constraints. The Führerprinzip established what Hitler conceived as a natural pyramid of leadership, with authority flowing strictly downward while responsibility moved upward. According to Nazi Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, this system meant unconditional authority downwards and responsibility upwards. At each level of this hierarchical structure, the sub-leader or Unterführer was completely subordinate to his superior while exercising absolute authority over his own subordinates. This created what historians describe as a chain of command that theoretically connected every German citizen to Hitler's personal will. The practical implementation of this hierarchy extended throughout German society, from government ministries to local party organizations, from youth groups to professional associations. Every organization within the Nazi state was restructured according to the Führerprinzip, with designated leaders demanding unquestioning obedience from those below while claiming to represent the Führer's will. As one Nazi document explained, the Führer principle represented by the party imposes complete responsibility on all party leaders for their respective spheres of activity. This hierarchical structure was not merely administrative but philosophical, reflecting Hitler's belief that human society naturally organized itself into relationships of dominance and submission. He proclaimed the Führerprinzip as the law of the Nazi Party as early as July 1921, and in Mein Kampf he declared that this principle would govern the new Reich. The 1926 Bamberg Conference saw Hitler invoke the Führerprinzip to assert his complete authority over party administrators, while the August 1928 party membership meeting in Munich affirmed his total control over Nazi ideology and practice. Central to the Führerprinzip was Hitler's claim that he personally embodied the collective will and destiny of the German people. As leader of the German Reich for life, he positioned himself not as an elected representative, but as the mystical incarnation of German racial consciousness. This went far beyond traditional concepts of political leadership to encompass what Nazi ideology called the Volksgeist, the racial soul of the German people. Hitler claimed unique insight and intuition that transcended rational debate or institutional expertise, making his personal will identical with the authentic interests of the German nation. This mystical dimension of leadership was crucial to Nazi propaganda and popular appeal. Hitler was presented not merely as a politician seeking power, but as a prophetic figure called by destiny to restore German greatness. The famous newspaper headline, "Today Hitler is all of Germany," reflected this claimed identity between the Führer and the nation he ruled. Nazi propaganda consistently emphasized that Hitler's authority derived not from democratic consent, but from his unique embodiment of German racial characteristics and historical mission. The cult of personality surrounding Hitler reinforced this mystical leadership concept. His image was displayed everywhere throughout German society, while the greeting Heil Hitler became not just a political gesture but a form of secular prayer acknowledging his quasi-divine status. Nazi educational materials taught children that Hitler possessed supernatural insight into German destiny, making opposition to his will tantamount to betrayal of the German people themselves. The Führerprinzip represented a comprehensive rejection of democratic principles, which Hitler viewed as fundamentally corrupted and contrary to natural law. Nazi ideology explicitly rejected liberalism, democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, stressing instead the subordination of the individual to the state and the necessity of strict obedience to leaders. Hitler argued that democratic processes were inherently divisive and weakening, preventing nations from expressing their authentic collective will through decisive leadership. In Mein Kampf, Hitler declared his intention to destroy the parliamentary system completely, believing it to be corrupt in principle, as those who reach power are inherent opportunists. He characterized democratic institutions as foreign impositions that weakened German racial solidarity and prevented the emergence of authentic leadership. The Führerprinzip was explicitly designed as an alternative to democratic governance, emphasizing what Nazis called organic leadership based on racial consciousness rather than artificial procedures like voting or constitutional constraints. This rejection of democracy extended to individual rights, which Nazi ideology subordinated to collective racial interests. Hitler argued that liberal concepts like civil liberties and personal freedoms were selfish individualism that weakened the folk community. The Führerprinzip demanded complete integration of individual identity with collective identity, making personal interests that conflicted with the Führer's will appear as betrayal of racial solidarity. Hitler's political philosophy centered on his belief that the force of will was decisive in determining the political course for a nation. This will theory elevated personal determination and decisiveness above rational analysis, institutional constraints, or popular consultation. In Hitler's view, great leaders succeeded not through careful deliberation or democratic consensus, but through the sheer force of their personality and their willingness to act decisively in pursuit of their vision. This emphasis on will over reason had profound implications for Nazi governance. Hitler positioned himself as the supreme decision-maker whose intuitive insight superseded expertise, legal precedent, or constitutional limitations. As one legal scholar noted, in German legal theory, Hitler was not only the supreme legislator, he was also the supreme judge. His personal will became the ultimate source of law, making the Führerprinzip a system where the Führer's word stood above all written law. The practical consequences of this will-based leadership became evident during World War II, when Hitler's strategic decisions increasingly contradicted military expertise and objective analysis. His belief in the power of will led him to reject retreats recommended by experienced generals and to persist in hopeless military campaigns simply through force of determination. As he told his generals on the eve of war, "It depends essentially on me, on my being, on my political skills. No one knows how much longer I will live. Therefore, it is better to have the conflict now." The Führerprinzip was implemented through systematic legal changes that transformed Germany from a constitutional democracy into a totalitarian state. The Enabling Act of 1933 permitted Hitler to enact laws without approval from either the Reichstag or President Hindenburg, effectively eliminating legislative constraints on his power. Subsequent legislation marginalized opposition parties, restricted civil liberties, and restructured government institutions according to the leader principle. Perhaps most significantly, German judges were required beginning in August 1934 to take a new oath swearing loyalty to Hitler personally rather than to the Constitution. The traditional oath, "I swear loyalty to the Constitution, obedience to the law, and conscientious fulfillment of the duties of my office, so help me God," was replaced with a pledge of personal allegiance to the Führer. This transformation made Hitler the ultimate source of legal authority, with his personal will superseding constitutional law and judicial precedent. The creation of special courts like the National Socialist People's Court (VGH) demonstrated how the Führerprinzip operated in practice. Judges were appointed to these courts based on their loyalty to Nazi ideology rather than legal expertise, and they functioned as investigators and prosecutors as well as judges. The purpose was not to dispense justice according to established law, but to implement Hitler's will through the appearance of legal proceedings. Under the Führerprinzip, state power had virtually no limits and could extend into all aspects of German political, social, and cultural life. Nazi ideology held that it was the government's duty not merely to devise policy, but to shape, coordinate, and regulate society, for the betterment of the nation. This totalitarian vision required the state to control press and unions, restrict civil liberties, manage education, and employ propaganda to create what Nazis called the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. The totalitarian implications of the Führerprinzip became evident in Nazi efforts to coordinate all German institutions according to the leader principle. Professional associations, cultural organizations, educational institutions, and even religious groups were either abolished or restructured to serve Nazi ideological goals. Individual Germans were expected to subordinate personal interests, family loyalties, and religious commitments to their duties within the hierarchical structure of the Nazi state. This totalitarian coordination extended to the economy, foreign policy, and military strategy. Hitler's role as Führer made him simultaneously leader of the party, the army, and the people, concentrating unprecedented power in a single individual. His authority encompassed what historians describe as being the supreme legislator, supreme administrator, and supreme judge, making him functionally omnipotent within the German political system. The Führerprinzip incorporated a doctrine of leadership infallibility that made criticism or opposition appear as disloyalty to the German nation itself. Hitler was presented as possessing supernatural insight into German destiny, making his decisions inherently correct regardless of their practical consequences. This cult of infallibility was reinforced through massive propaganda campaigns that attributed every success to the Führer's wisdom, while explaining failures as the result of subordinate incompetence or enemy sabotage. The practical consequences of this infallibility doctrine became catastrophic during World War II. As military defeats mounted and the war situation deteriorated, Hitler's refusal to acknowledge errors or accept advice led to increasingly desperate and destructive policies. The bonds of loyalty created through the Führerprinzip trapped both Nazi leadership and ordinary Germans in what historian Ian Kershaw describes as a fateful commitment to follow Hitler down to 1945, even as it became clear he was leading Germany into the abyss. The ultimate failure of the Führerprinzip demonstrated the inherent dangers of concentrating absolute power in any individual, regardless of their apparent competence or popular support. Modern scholars note that the belief that the more power a president or prime minister wields, the more we should be impressed by that politician is a dangerous fallacy. The Nazi experience shows how the rejection of democratic checks and balances can transform even initially popular leaders into sources of unprecedented destruction. Hitler's Führerprinzip thus represented more than authoritarian governance. It constituted a complete alternative to democratic civilization based on the worship of individual will and the rejection of institutional constraints. By transforming political authority into religious devotion and making law subordinate to personal will, the leader principle created the ideological framework for genocide, aggressive war, and the systematic destruction of human rights. Understanding this principle remains crucial for recognizing how democratic institutions can be systematically dismantled through the concentration of power in charismatic but unaccountable leadership. Principle 6: Anti-parliamentarianism and anti-communism. Hitler's philosophical rejection of both liberal democracy and communism represented a sophisticated ideological assault on the two dominant political systems of his era. This dual opposition was not merely tactical but stemmed from his fundamental belief that both systems weaken nations by dividing peoples against themselves: parliamentary democracy through endless debate and compromise, communism through class struggle. Yet Hitler's anti-communism was complex and paradoxical, combining genuine ideological hostility with grudging admiration for Stalin's authoritarian methods, particularly his elimination of Jewish communists. This principle became central to Nazi ideology, providing both a negative definition of what Germany should reject and a positive vision of unified national will under absolute leadership. Hitler's rejection of parliamentary democracy was rooted in his experience of the Weimar Republic, which he characterized as fundamentally corrupted and incapable of expressing authentic national will. He viewed the constant coalition building, compromises, and political maneuvering of democratic governance as evidence that parliamentary systems were inherently weak and divisive. In Mein Kampf, Hitler declared his intention to destroy the parliamentary system completely, believing it to be corrupt in principle, as those who reach power are inherent opportunists. The Weimar Republic's instability provided Hitler with compelling evidence for his anti-parliamentary arguments. Between 1919 and 1933, Germany experienced 20 separate governments in 14 years, with chancellors frequently unable to maintain stable coalitions or implement coherent policies. Hitler argued that this governmental chaos demonstrated the fundamental flaw of democratic systems. They encourage division rather than unity, weakness rather than strength. He claimed that parliamentary democracy's emphasis on debate and compromise prevented nations from acting decisively when faced with existential challenges. Hitler's critique extended beyond practical politics to encompass what he saw as the moral corruption inherent in democratic processes. He argued that electoral competition rewarded demagogues and opportunists rather than authentic leaders, while the need to appeal to diverse constituencies forced politicians to make contradictory promises they could never fulfill. The democratic emphasis on individual rights and procedural fairness was, in Hitler's view, a luxury that nations could not afford in the struggle for survival. He declared that the majority can never replace the man, and that the majority is not only always a representative of stupidity, but also of cowardice. Central to Hitler's anti-parliamentary philosophy was his belief that democracy inherently diluted the authentic will of the nation through endless compromise and debate. He argued that when political parties were forced to negotiate and make concessions, the resulting policies represented not the true interests of the German people but artificial compromises that satisfied no one. This process of democratic negotiation was, in Hitler's view, particularly dangerous because it prevented nations from responding quickly and decisively to threats. Hitler contrasted this democratic weakness with what he saw as the natural hierarchy and unified purpose of authoritarian systems. In his ideal state, the will of the leader would be identical with the will of the people, eliminating the need for debate, opposition, or compromise. The Führerprinzip was explicitly designed to replace the artificial divisions of parliamentary politics with what Nazis called the organic unity of the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. Democratic pluralism was reframed as national division, while authoritarian unity was presented as the natural expression of racial solidarity. This critique of democratic compromise extended to Hitler's foreign policy philosophy. He argued that democratic nations were inherently disadvantaged in international competition because their decision-making processes were slow and their commitments unreliable. Authoritarian states, by contrast, could act with the speed and consistency necessary for success in what Hitler saw as the eternal struggle between nations. The failure of democratic countries to prevent his early territorial acquisitions seemed to confirm his thesis about democratic weakness and indecision. Hitler's opposition to communism was inseparable from his anti-Semitic worldview, which recast Marxist ideology as Judeo-Bolshevism, a supposed Jewish conspiracy designed to weaken nations through class struggle. This conspiracy theory held that communism was not a genuine working-class movement, but a Jewish plot to destroy traditional societies and establish Jewish domination. Hitler claimed that Jewish communists deliberately fostered class conflict to weaken national unity and make countries vulnerable to foreign conquest. The Judeo-Bolshevism myth was central to Nazi propaganda and provided ideological justification for both domestic repression and foreign aggression. Hitler argued that the Russian Revolution had been orchestrated by Jewish conspirators who used communism to destroy the traditional Russian state and establish Jewish rule. He claimed that German communists were similarly working to undermine German strength on behalf of their Jewish masters, making anti-communism a form of national defense. This conspiracy theory allowed Hitler to position Nazism as the defender of authentic national interests against both foreign and domestic enemies. The anti-Semitic dimension of Hitler's anti-communism was evident in his treatment of communist prisoners and territories. The Nazi regime's first concentration camp at Dachau was established primarily to hold communist political prisoners, many of whom were tortured and murdered. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Commissar Order directed German soldiers to execute Soviet political officers on the grounds that they were agents of the Jewish conspiracy. Hitler's war against communism was thus simultaneously a war against what he characterized as Jewish world domination. Despite his public condemnation of communism as a Jewish conspiracy, Hitler privately expressed considerable admiration for Stalin's authoritarian methods, particularly his elimination of Jewish communists. In his private table talks, Hitler praised Stalin as one of the greatest of living men because he succeeded in forging a state out of the Slavic family of rabbits, albeit only with the harshest of compulsion. This admiration reflected Hitler's complex understanding of Stalin as a nationalist ruler who had used communist ideology as a tool for Russian imperial expansion rather than genuine Marxist revolution. Hitler's private assessment of Stalin contradicted his public propaganda, which consistently portrayed the Soviet leader as a puppet of Jewish Bolshevism. Internally, Hitler argued that Stalin was only Russia, the continuation of Tsarist panslavism, and that Bolshevism is only a means to an end for advancing Russian national interests. Hitler claimed that Stalin was only waiting for the moment of maturity of their own intelligentsia in the USSR in order to make an end of the Jewry he still needed today as a leadership. This interpretation allowed Hitler to view Stalin as a fellow nationalist who would eventually eliminate Jewish influence from his regime. The contradiction between Hitler's public and private views of Stalin revealed the propagandistic nature of much Nazi anti-communist rhetoric. While Hitler genuinely opposed Marxist ideology and feared Soviet territorial expansion, his admiration for Stalin's ruthless methods suggested that his primary objection to communism was not its authoritarianism but its internationalist and allegedly Jewish character. Hitler defended Stalin against critics who called him a bank robber, arguing that Stalin's revolutionary activities were motivated by political conviction rather than personal gain. This grudging respect reflected Hitler's appreciation for what he saw as Stalin's willingness to use extreme violence in pursuit of national goals. Hitler's complex attitude towards Stalin and communism became evident in the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, which temporarily aligned the two ideologically opposed regimes for mutual strategic benefit. Despite years of anti-communist propaganda, Hitler was willing to ally with the Soviet Union when it served German interests, demonstrating the tactical flexibility of Nazi ideology. The pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between German and Soviet spheres of influence, suggesting that both leaders prioritized territorial expansion over ideological consistency. However, this tactical cooperation did not represent a genuine reconciliation between Nazi and communist ideologies. Hitler viewed the pact as a temporary expedient that would allow Germany to avoid a two-front war while preparing for the eventual confrontation with the Soviet Union. His private comments during this period continued to express admiration for Stalin's authoritarian methods, while maintaining that the ultimate conflict between German and Russian imperial ambitions was inevitable. The Nazi-Soviet pact thus represented the triumph of realpolitik over ideological purity in both regimes. When Hitler finally broke the pact and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he returned to his public rhetoric about Jewish Bolshevism while privately acknowledging Stalin's effectiveness as a nationalist leader. This duality reflected the complex relationship between Hitler's genuine anti-communism and his opportunistic use of anti-communist propaganda. The invasion itself was justified both as a war against Jewish-controlled communism and as a struggle for Lebensraum, demonstrating how Hitler's various ideological principles reinforced each other in practice. Hitler's anti-parliamentary and anti-communist principles provided justification for the systematic elimination of all political opposition in Nazi Germany. The Nazis banned all political parties in 1933, arguing that parliamentary politics inherently weakened national unity by encouraging division and conflict. Communist and social democratic leaders were arrested en masse, with many sent to concentration camps or murdered outright. The elimination of political opposition was presented not as tyranny, but as the restoration of national unity and the removal of foreign influences. This systematic repression extended beyond formal political parties to encompass trade unions, civil society organizations, and any institutions that might serve as centers of opposition to Nazi rule. Hitler argued that such organizations represented the artificial divisions of liberal society and needed to be replaced by Nazi-controlled institutions that reflected authentic national consciousness. The goal was not merely to eliminate opposition, but to create what Nazis called the Volksgemeinschaft, a racially unified people's community that would express its will through the Führer rather than through democratic processes. The legal framework for this repression was established through the Enabling Act of 1933, which allowed Hitler to rule by decree without parliamentary approval. This effectively ended democratic governance in Germany while maintaining the appearance of legal continuity. Hitler justified these extraordinary powers as necessary to combat the twin threats of parliamentary chaos and communist revolution, arguing that democratic procedures were luxuries that Germany could not afford in its struggle for survival. Hitler viewed his opposition to parliamentary democracy and communism as part of a broader global struggle between competing worldviews. He argued that liberal democracy and Marxist communism were both expressions of Jewish influence designed to weaken traditional national states and establish Jewish world domination. Nazi Germany was positioned as the defender of authentic nationalism against these allegedly foreign ideologies. This global perspective justified not only domestic repression, but also aggressive foreign policy designed to eliminate democratic and communist states. The Nazi war effort was thus conceived as an ideological crusade as well as a territorial conquest. German soldiers were taught that they were fighting not just for German interests, but for the preservation of European civilization against the twin threats of democratic decadence and communist barbarism. The treatment of prisoners of war and occupied populations reflected these ideological commitments, with communist officials and democratic politicians receiving particularly harsh treatment as agents of enemy ideologies. This ideological framework also shaped Nazi plans for the post-war world. Hitler envisioned a Europe dominated by authoritarian nationalist regimes allied with or subordinate to Germany, with both democratic and communist systems eliminated entirely. The establishment of puppet regimes in occupied territories was designed not just to serve German interests but to demonstrate the superiority of authoritarian nationalism over democratic and communist alternatives. This vision represented the logical conclusion of Hitler's anti-parliamentary and anti-communist principles, a world in which his preferred form of governance would be universal. Hitler's dual opposition to parliamentary democracy and communism thus formed a coherent ideological system that provided both negative definitions of what to reject and positive visions of authoritarian alternatives. While tactically flexible and internally contradictory, these principles served crucial functions in Nazi ideology by discrediting existing political systems while justifying unprecedented concentrations of power. Understanding this ideological framework remains essential for recognizing how democratic institutions can be systematically undermined through the manipulation of anti-democratic and anti-communist sentiments. Principle 7. The Master-Slave Morality. Drawing from his profound misinterpretation of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical concepts, Hitler developed what scholars describe as a form of procedural virtue ethics that transformed morality itself into a weapon of racial ideology. This sophisticated moral framework demanded unconditional obedience to what Nazis defined as racial virtues, while simultaneously convincing perpetrators that their atrocities were morally righteous acts. By replacing traditional Christian concepts of self-denial and universal compassion with racial self-assertion towards those deemed inferior, Hitler created an inverted moral system that enabled ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil while maintaining clear consciences. Hitler's appropriation of Nietzsche's master-slave morality concept represented one of philosophy's most tragic misinterpretations. Nietzsche had developed his master-slave distinction as a historical and critical analysis of how different moral systems emerged from different social positions, not as a prescription for racial hierarchy or genocidal policy. He described master morality as a value system created by the powerful who defined good according to their own qualities, strength, nobility, pride, while characterizing the weak as bad. Slave morality, by contrast, arose from the resentment of the powerless, who inverted these values by calling the powerful evil and celebrating weakness, humility, and compassion as virtuous. However, Hitler and Nazi ideologists stripped away Nietzsche's nuanced philosophical analysis and transformed it into crude racial ideology. They equated Nietzsche's masters with the Aryan race and his slaves with Jews and other supposedly inferior peoples, creating a biological determinism that Nietzsche himself would have rejected. This distortion was facilitated by Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, who systematically falsified her brother's works and letters after his mental breakdown in 1889. She added, removed, and changed passages to align his philosophy with her own virulent anti-Semitism and those of her husband, Bernhard Forster, an ardent anti-Semite who founded a failed Aryan colony in Paraguay. Elizabeth's manipulation created what one scholar calls the most destructive myth of all, Nietzsche as the godfather of fascism. The Nazis selectively used Nietzsche's writings to bolster their ideology and built a museum in Weimar to celebrate the philosopher, though Hitler himself likely read little, if any, of Nietzsche's actual work. When Elizabeth died in 1935, Hitler personally attended her funeral, cementing the false association between Nietzsche's philosophy and Nazi ideology. The irony was profound. Nietzsche had explicitly opposed anti-Semitism, called his sister a llama who has jumped away from me and gone among the anti-Semites, and would have been horrified by the Nazi appropriation of his ideas. Nazi morality was conceived as what philosopher Wolfgang Bialas describes as procedural virtue ethics, a system that combined absolute virtues demanding unconditional obedience with social engineering attitudes that replaced common-sense intuitions with an ideological catalog of virtues and commands. This framework created what Nazis called an ethnic conscience, or racial conscience, that recognized moral obligations only towards members of one's own race. The Christian concept of universal human dignity and moral care for all people was explicitly rejected and replaced with the idea that race determined whether someone was worthy of moral consideration. The goal was to develop what Nazi ideology called biological attitudes and feelings as part of a racial character. This racial conscience was presented not as abandoning morality, but as discovering authentic morality rooted in biological reality. Nazis argued that traditional Christian morality was itself a form of slave morality, a Jewish invention designed to weaken strong races by making them feel guilty for their natural superiority. By contrast, Nazi racial morality was portrayed as liberating Germans to act according to their true nature as members of the master race. This procedural ethics framework meant that Nazi morality focused not on the content of actions, but on the racial identity and ideological conviction of the actor. The same action could be moral or immoral depending on who performed it and why. Killing a Jew was presented as morally praiseworthy when done by an ideologically committed Nazi acting to protect racial purity, but the same act would be criminal if motivated by personal gain or performed by someone deemed racially inferior. The ideal Nazi was to be what ideology called the Weltanschauungskrieger, worldview warrior, a race-conscious, ideologically dedicated political soldier who could perform crimes for the sake of the Nordic race in Germany with a clean conscience while perfectly convinced of doing the right thing and acting morally. This figure represented the culmination of Nazi moral engineering, someone who had so thoroughly internalized racial ideology that atrocity appeared as virtue. Critically, the worldview warrior was not presented as someone who thoughtlessly followed orders without hesitation, but rather as someone who consciously took on responsibility and exercised moral judgment as defined by Nazism. Nazi ideology specifically rejected the image of the blindly obedient automaton, instead celebrating the creative initiative of those who understood Nazi principles so thoroughly they could independently determine the racially correct course of action. As one Nazi document explained, "We want one thing above all, to be honest to ourselves and know why we act one way and not another. We want to be aware of the consequences of our actions. We want to live in such a fashion that we can always be responsible for ourselves." This emphasis on moral agency and personal responsibility was crucial to the functioning of Nazi genocide. By convincing perpetrators that they were making conscious moral choices rather than simply following orders, the regime created individuals who would pursue genocidal goals with initiative and creativity. The worldview warrior was expected to be physically and spiritually healthy and tough on himself, always considering consequences and insisting on doing what he considered necessary, just, and moral. This self-conception as morally responsible agents allowed perpetrators to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as decent, ethical people. Central to Hitler's master-slave morality was the explicit replacement of Christian concepts of self-denial, humility, and compassion with racial self-assertion towards those deemed inferior. Nazi ideology characterized traditional Christian virtues as expressions of slave morality designed to weaken the strong by making them feel guilty for their natural superiority. Hitler and his ideologists promoted instead what they called positive Christianity, which stripped away Christian emphasis on suffering, sacrifice, and universal love, replacing it with an aggressive, militant Jesus who allegedly fought against Jewish influence. This inverted morality transformed traditional vices into virtues and virtues into vices. Compassion for the weak became racial treason, mercy towards enemies became a failure of racial duty, universal human solidarity became corruption of racial purity. Meanwhile, ruthlessness towards the racially inferior was reframed as moral courage. Participation in genocide became fulfillment of sacred duty. Elimination of the weak was presented as obedience to natural and divine law. As Nazi ideology explicitly stated, natural selection and the struggle for existence were declared by the Nazis to be the most divine laws. Peoples and individuals deemed inferior were said to be incapable of surviving without those deemed superior. This moral inversion extended to how Nazis conceptualized individual development and flourishing. Traditional morality held that individuals achieved moral worth through their choices and actions, regardless of birth circumstances. Nazi morality claimed instead that an individual could only develop their capabilities and individual characteristics within the framework of the individual's racial membership. One's race determined not only capabilities but also moral status. making racial identity the foundation of all ethical evaluation. The ultimate purpose of Nazi master-slave morality was to create a moral framework that justified the unjustifiable by transforming genocide into virtue. As historian Claudia Kuntz points out, it is impossible to explain the appeal of Nazism without understanding how the regime made evil appear virtuous to millions of ordinary Germans. The ideology didn't simply permit atrocities, but actively presented them as moral obligations that good people were duty-bound to perform. Wehrmacht soldiers who participated in the War of Extermination on the Eastern Front provide a disturbing case study of this moral framework in action. Even as they implemented Hitler's genocidal vision through mass executions, starvation policies, and systematic brutality, German soldiers carefully constructed narratives in which they appeared as decent men fighting for a worthy cause against an evil enemy. They emphasized their virtuous qualities, justified German atrocities as necessary responses to enemy barbarism, and portrayed themselves as relatively benign occupiers. The more they convinced themselves they remained decent men, the more willing they became to prosecute the war of extermination without reservations or pangs of conscience. This phenomenon of maintaining moral self-conception while committing atrocities reveals the power of Nazi ethical engineering. The regime successfully created what scholars describe as perpetrators with clear consciences, individuals who genuinely believed they were fulfilling moral duties while participating in crimes against humanity. The development of this ethnic conscience was achieved through systematic indoctrination that replaced universal moral principles with racial particularism, making care for outsiders appear as betrayal of one's own people. Hitler's master-slave morality thus represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of Nazi ideology, the transformation of morality itself into an instrument of genocide. By creating an ethical framework that made atrocity appear virtuous, the regime enabled ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil while maintaining their self-image as moral actors. Understanding this principle remains crucial for recognizing how moral language and ethical concepts can be weaponized to justify crimes against humanity, demonstrating that the greatest evils are often committed by those who believe themselves to be doing good. The critique and counter-arguments. Hitler's ideological framework was not composed of legitimate philosophical ideas, but rather dangerous distortions of existing concepts combined with outright fabrications presented as scientific fact. Modern scholarship across multiple disciplines, genetics, evolutionary biology, philosophy, and history, has systematically dismantled every pillar of Nazi ideology, revealing it as a pseudo-scientific construction designed to justify predetermined conclusions of racial hierarchy and genocide. Hitler's racial theories have been thoroughly debunked by modern genetics, which has demonstrated conclusively that the concept of distinct human races with hierarchical capabilities has no biological foundation. The Human Genome Project and subsequent genetic research have revealed that there is more genetic variation within purported racial groups than between them, and that no human populations can be legitimately thought of as unique evolutionary lineages. As geneticists explain, this means that our species of anatomically modern humans have maintained sufficiently high amounts of gene flow between its regional populations throughout its existence, and show no evidence of any subgroups diverging from a whole species. The genomics community continues to work actively to scientifically debunk eugenic myths and combat modern-day manifestations of eugenics and scientific racism. Eugenics, the theory underlying Nazi racial policy, is now recognized as scientifically inaccurate and based on a prejudiced and incorrect understanding of Mendelian genetics that claimed abstract human qualities, e.g., intelligence and social behaviors, were inherited in a simple fashion. The implementation of eugenic practices, particularly by the Nazi German racial state between 1933 and 1945, caused widespread harm and represented one of history's greatest perversions of scientific authority. Moreover, the Aryan ideal that Hitler promoted was itself a complete fantasy. Even Hitler himself did not fit his own physical description of the master race. He had dark brown hair rather than blonde, though he did have blue eyes. It is a common misconception that the Nazis considered blonde hair and blue eyes to be essential racial characteristics of the Aryan race. In reality, the Nazis considered facial features and skull shapes to be more important indicators, though even these criteria had no scientific validity. The propaganda ideal of the blonde, blue-eyed Nordic was promoted symbolically, but in practice most Germans were neither blonde nor blue-eyed, making such traits practically meaningless for determining racial status. The absurdity of Nazi racial science was perfectly captured in a famous French cartoon that described the ideal Aryan as being as blonde as Hitler, as slim as Göring, and as tall as Goebbels, highlighting that even top Nazi leaders failed to meet their own fabricated racial standards. Modern science confirms what critics recognized even then. There is no genetic basis for Aryan purity, and the idea itself stands as a warning of the horrors that can stem from racial supremacy. Hitler's interpretation of social Darwinism represented a fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary theory. Darwin's theory describes biological adaptation through natural selection, a process by which organisms with traits suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. This is purely a descriptive account of how species change over time, not a prescriptive moral framework for how human societies should be organized. Critically, Darwin himself never advocated for the social implications that Hitler and other social Darwinists derived from his work. As scholars note, social Darwinism is largely a misappropriation of Darwin's ideas, as Darwin himself did not advocate for the social implications that later thinkers would derive from his work. The concept of survival of the fittest referred to reproductive success in specific environmental contexts, not to moral or cultural superiority. Darwin's actual writings emphasize the interconnectedness and diversity of species, rather than hierarchical rankings of superior and inferior organisms. The application of evolutionary concepts to human social organization was a distortion promoted primarily by Herbert Spencer and later appropriated by the Nazis. While scattered passages in Darwin's Descent of Man might be interpreted as suggesting that survival of the fittest could explain social hierarchies, Darwin never claimed it should justify or guide human affairs. The Nazi appropriation of Darwinian language served to legitimize policies that contradicted genuine scientific understanding of evolution. The philosophical sources Hitler claimed to draw from, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Wagner, were either profoundly misinterpreted or taken completely out of context. Nietzsche's concept of master-slave morality was a critical historical analysis of how different moral systems emerged, not a prescription for racial hierarchy. Most damning, Nietzsche explicitly opposed anti-Semitism and nationalism, the very foundations of Nazi ideology. He called his sister a llama who has jumped away from me and gone among the anti-Semites, and would have been horrified by the Nazi appropriation of his ideas. The false association between Nietzsche and Nazism was largely manufactured by his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who systematically falsified his works and letters after his mental breakdown. She added, removed, and changed passages to align his philosophy with her own virulent anti-Semitism. One scholar describes this as the most destructive myth of all, Nietzsche as the godfather of fascism, created through criminal manipulation of his writings. When Elizabeth died in 1935, Hitler personally attended her funeral, cementing this false association despite the fact that Hitler himself likely read little, if any, of Nietzsche's actual work. Similarly, Wagner and Schopenhauer were appropriated for Nazi purposes despite the fact that their philosophies, when understood in context, did not support Nazi conclusions. Wagner's anti-Semitism and German nationalism were products of 19th-century European prejudices, but his philosophical influences, particularly Schopenhauer's emphasis on art as refuge and source of redemption, were fundamentally misunderstood by Nazi ideologists. The Nazis selectively extracted elements that seemed to support their ideology, while ignoring the broader philosophical contexts that would have contradicted their simplistic racial theories. Perhaps most fundamentally, Hitler's entire worldview was built on conspiracy theories and scapegoating rather than genuine analysis of Germany's problems. When Germany faced complex economic and social challenges, Hitler provided simple answers that blamed specific groups, particularly Jews, for all of society's ills. This conspiracy thinking served crucial psychological and political functions by offering explanations that required no careful analysis and justified predetermined targets. The myth of Jewish Bolshevism, the stab-in-the-back legend, and allegations of a Jewish world conspiracy were all fabrications without factual foundation. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which Hitler cited as evidence of Jewish conspiracy, was a known forgery, a fabricated document created by the Russian secret police to justify anti-Semitic pogroms. Despite being exposed as fraudulent, it was quickly translated into at least 16 languages, including German, and Nazi party leaders, including Hitler, promoted it as authentic evidence. Economic scapegoating was particularly pernicious. During the Great Depression, Hitler blamed Jewish bankers and businesses for Germany's financial troubles despite Jews comprising only a small fraction of Germany's population. He promoted myths that Jews control the banks, the money supply, the economy and businesses, of the community, of the country, of the world. These stereotypes ignored the complex economic, political and social factors that actually caused Germany's problems, instead offering Jews as convenient scapegoats for failures requiring no deeper analysis. The reliance on conspiracy theories, rather than factual analysis, revealed the fundamentally irrational nature of Nazi ideology. Conspiracy thinking requires a scapegoat who can be blamed for all problems, and for Hitler that scapegoat was always Jews. This approach made it impossible to address Germany's actual challenges because the proposed solutions, eliminating Jews and other scapegoated groups, had nothing to do with the real causes of economic depression, military defeat, or social instability. Modern historians recognize that anti-Semitic scapegoating and conspiracy theories have frequently motivated violence against Jewish communities throughout history, culminating in the Nazi genocide of European Jews. The power of these conspiracy theories lay not in their factual accuracy, they had none, but in their psychological appeal to populations seeking simple explanations for complex problems. Understanding this dynamic remains crucial for recognizing how conspiracy thinking continues to fuel hatred and violence in contemporary societies. Hitler's ideological framework thus represented not philosophical sophistication but intellectual bankruptcy, a system built on scientific falsehoods, philosophical distortions, and conspiracy theories designed to justify predetermined conclusions of racial hierarchy and genocide. Every element of Nazi ideology has been systematically refuted by modern scholarship, revealing it as a dangerous fabrication that weaponized the authority of science and philosophy to enable crimes against humanity. Understanding Hitler's philosophies isn't about giving credence to his ideas, it's about recognizing the warning signs of how dangerous ideologies develop and spread. These weren't random hatreds or spontaneous violence. They were systematic beliefs that convinced millions of ordinary people to participate in or ignore genocide. Hitler didn't just use force, he used ideas, twisted philosophies, and false science to make the unthinkable seem reasonable. The core takeaway is this: dangerous ideologies often present themselves as rational systems with philosophical backing. They offer simple answers to complex problems and promise to restore a mythical golden age. They identify scapegoats for society's issues and present themselves as the only solution. Today, we must remain vigilant against any ideology that divides people into hierarchies of human worth, that promises simple solutions through the elimination of others, or that demands absolute obedience to charismatic leaders. What warning signs do you see in modern movements that echo these dangerous principles? Share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding history isn't just about the past, it's about protecting our future. Remember to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the ideas that shaped our world, both for better and for worse.